drink the lion's share, finish up. Right. So,
Second invitation.
right, a toast to our authors, to Donis Casey, whose debut this is, and to Martin Edwards, whose debut this is tonight. So this is really exciting. Donis has gone in a new direction with a book called The Wrong Girl. But for those of you who have been reading the Alifair Tucker mysteries, Blanche is the daughter in The Wrong Hill to Die On. They came to Tempe because she had a medical condition. It's a wonderful book. Now, by a series of fortunate coincidences, we actually have ended up with a supply of hardcover first printings of Donis's books and some of Martin's, and so we're giving them to you for a very, very low price. And I would encourage you to buy them because they'll be valuable in years to come, and they're a rare bargain. Isn't that nice?
From your mouth to God.
I hope so. I hope so indeed. Right, now Martin, who, as I've just mentioned, is here from the UK, is here in a double role. He is the author of a new book called Gallows Court, which is starting a new series. And what Diane, who's over here, has a different take on it, or at least a new take on it than I do. But Martin, what did we decide to call it?
Well, it was Barbara's, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Can you understand my English accent? It's a more difficult thing.
We need subtitles.
Yes, I'll leave that to you. Yes, Barbara came up with a great phrase, which I love and which I've now stolen, which is Golden Age Gothic.
And tomorrow, the new November book news is going to post. And as I write it, it's easy for me to see trends in publishing because, you know, I have to look at the whole picture for November. And there is a whole slug of books that all of a sudden indicate to me that the Gothic novel, think of Shirley Jackson, think of Wendell Collins, the modern Gothic has suddenly come back, which I think may be a reaction to the mess that we are in the whole world. It can't be any weirder, right, than what's actually going on. But examples of that might be Ruth Ware, for example, if you've read any of her books. Kate Morton, who I think is a wonderful writer from Australia. And while Gallows Court is a Golden Age Gothic, Martin's next book, when it comes along, which is called
Mortmain Hall.
is really a Gothic because it's just like the fall of the House of Usher, except the house goes over a cliff in North Yorkshire. I mean, it's really just a classic, I think, recalling Edgar Allan Poe. So, Martin, where did you get this kind of dark streak? Because I've known you for years, and you're such a really sweet guy, but when you write, you come out with this dark stuff.
Well, I'd written contemporary novels throughout my career. I'd written a series set in Liverpool, and more recently a series set in the Lake District in England, and that's very much an ongoing series, and there will be other ones soon. But I was involved with the British Library Crime Classics. I wrote a book called Golden Age of Murder, which is about the detection club of the 1930s and the crime fiction of that time. So having read so many of these older books, the well-known ones and the very obscure ones as well, I thought I'd like to write something in that vein, but with a kind of modern psychological sensibility. And so that was the idea for Gallows Court. And I decided to write a different kind of book. I've always planned my books. I've always known who is going to kill whom and why. I've kind of worked back from there. But with Gallows Court, I started with the character of Rachel Sabanake, who is a young woman who comes to London. She's fabulously rich, and it soon becomes clear she's exceptionally ruthless. And she becomes involved in a sequence of bizarre murder mysteries, and that was my starting point. I didn't know how it was going to end. So it was a different way of writing, and a different period, 1930, and a different style of protagonist. So although I didn't set out to write a Gothic kind of book, I guess that's what I found myself coming up with in the end.
Well, I certainly agree with Diane that falls into the psychological or domestic suspense category. I just like to think it's a subgenre called the Golden Age Gothic. And that always implies, a lack of trust among people, where your nearest and dearest may well want to be killing you. If you think of The Girl on the Train or Gone Girl, those are other examples of that. I agree that Rachel is exceptionally ruthless. Would she be so ruthless if she weren't so rich?
Well, it's the idea of the great wealth is it gives her power. It's the power to do pretty much whatever she wants to do. And the challenge for the young journalist in the story, the other protagonist, Jacob Flint, is to try to figure out what her game is, what is she trying to achieve. So that's the dynamic at the start of the book. You've got this young, naive but very determined investigative crime reporter trying to figure out what Rachel is all about, and she doesn't want him to find out.
What was the order of the 1930s for you? Because you could have said it, you could have made it Edwardian, you could have made it 1920s.
Yes, well, as I say, I'd read so many of these books. I'd written The Golden Age of Murder, which had done pretty well, and the crime classics had done well. So I thought it was a nice idea to set a book in the very year that the Detection Club was founded in England, 1930. So that was the idea about the timing of it, and to write a book that it's not a pastiche whodunit really. It's more of a psychological thriller, I suppose. But and in those days, the Detection Club, Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers didn't admit thriller writers to the club. But I tried to write a thriller that even Dorothy might have possibly approved.
So I had mentioned that Martin is actually the president of the Detection Club, which is a crime writers organization in the UK by invitation only. So you have to be invited, and past presidents include, in fact, Dorothy Sayers and Agatha Christie and Harry Keating and Simon Brett.
And G.K. Chesterton.
And G.K. Chesterton. Was he the first?
He was the first.
He was, right.
Yeah, there've been 8.
Okay.
So quality control has slipped in recent years.
And I was reminding Martin at dinner that I was actually as a guest, I was actually at the Detection Club meeting in which Harry Keating passed on the presidency to Simon Brett, which was how many years ago?
That was in the year 2000.
Wow, it was a long time ago. I remember particularly because Phyllis James and I both arrived in the powder room at the same time, and she didn't have a lot of interest in what was going on, so I sat on the floor and talked to her for 45 minutes. Remember how pink the powder room is in the Savoy? Maybe you don't. No.
I really
Well,
don't.
I can tell you that in 2000, the powder room in the Savoy in London was seriously pink. And Phyllis had the chair, so I sat on the floor. This is P.D. James I'm talking about, known to us as Phyllis. And it was absolutely wonderful to have that experience with her.
And you met Eric the Skull.
I did meet Eric the Skull, who lit up, if I recall.
He does.
Yes.
He still lights up. There is a skull and a new member of the club. There was a ceremony last Wednesday. A new member has to swear an oath on Eric the Skull.
It's actually quite a Halloween sort of experience to go to it. But anyway, remarkable. So we'll come back to Martin, but let's talk to Donis over here, because we've been through how many Alifair Tucker books together? You have to use the microphone.
10 Alifairs, and then this is book number 11. And, I'd said when I first started out that there were going to be 10, even though I think there's probably another couple in
Well, we can't be totally done with
no,
the Tuckers.
well, no, there's still, I haven't done The Last Child, and there's a couple of other things that need to be done, taken care of, I think. But I had reached 1919. I started out in 1912, and I reached 1919, and when I was getting ready to write the next book, I was thinking, well, it's going to be the 20s. 1920. So I thought, well, this is a kind of a whole new world. The war is over. This is between the war, and the world is starting to change. And I've more or less gotten, Alifair has many children, and the older ones are basically taken care of, but the younger ones are coming up into a whole new world. And so I'm thinking, well, it made me curious into this new world that's coming about, what's going to happen with these younger children. And I had already set up Blanche as being particularly louche, beautiful, and not so interested in a normal sort of life. And so I thought, well, let's just go in a whole new direction and start a whole new world and a whole new series of characters. And it was quite a kind of a shot in the arm, really, to start this whole new world. I only have the one character that I really know now, so I had to create a whole new world. It was really quite interesting for me and a lot of fun to do.
So you did foreshadow Blanche's interest in film in The Wrong Hill to Die On, because her aunt, who is has a shaky marriage, let's
Yes.
say. In fact, if I remember right, I talked you out of actually having her aunt go to
Disappear
California forever. All right.
Yeah, that's right.
I didn't think that would be an entirely
Workable.
successful.
Yeah.
So she came back, but it is not surprising then that Blanche was interested
In fact, during that book, there was a movie being shot
in Tempe.
in Tempe,
And they
which
blew up the
actually
school.
happened.
Yeah, they
which
blew up
actually
the schoolhouse,
blew up
which
the
I
schoolhouse,
absolutely
yeah.
love. Did that really happen?
That really happened, yes. That truly happened. The whole movie, the cast and everything came out on the train from Hollywood to Tempe to shoot to shoot a movie that was based on a book that was written called The Yucky. It was written by a man who had come to Tempe because of his health, and he was friends with this man named Hobart Bosworth, who in fact you may never have heard of, but he was actually quite an important early founder of Hollywood, and Universal Pictures turned out later to be Universal Pictures, but he was friends with this Dane something, I don't remember now. But he decided to come out and shoot the movie in Tempe, which is where the book takes place, and where the Yaqui Indians had settled from Mexico. And so I actually did not have that in mind when I first started writing the book, but when I do my research, you discover all kinds of things when you do your research. And I thought, especially they're blowing up the schoolhouse with 700 pounds of dynamite, and I thought, well, what if there's something in that schoolhouse? So you get all kinds of wonderful ideas just from reading the newspapers from that particular time period. So that's what got me going with that. And so Blanche has had the movies in mind ever since then. She was only 10 years old when that book took place, but now she's 15. And
15 and trafficked, right?
Yeah.
So this is a Me Too book in a great many respects. But you know, what's really interesting, there's a new biography of Edison that Edmund Morris, who recently died, has written. Edison, because he was not an altogether nice man, and a ruthless competitor, got a lock on the movies back in New Jersey when and so in response to that, people went to California, to Hollywood, and before talkies, they could film in the open air. So Phoenix, Tempe, whatever it was, and California were great places to make silent movies. You know, they created sound stages once they had to protect the quality of the sound. But before then, they could just film outdoors. So it made perfectly good sense for
here. And Bosworth, Hobart Bosworth, was a stage actor, but he lost his voice. And he actually went out to California to get his voice back, and thought, oh, this is nice. We can make movies out here. So that's he actually was one of the movers and shakers that moved. And besides Edison, was making a lot of problems for people making movies on the East Coast.
Now, he wasn't what we call a sharing guy.
He
And
was
so now that California is burning, it's hard for us to imagine that, and Arizona had clean air, that it was a spa kind of a thing to come to Arizona. Remember back to Doc Holliday? I mean, he came out here for tuberculosis, right, like Switzerland, because our air was so clear. And that's how it was. So Blanche at 15 is back in Boynton, Oklahoma, and feeling stifled.
Exactly, yeah, and someone comes through. One thing that when I was thinking about how to write this book, and I was trying to remember being 15.
Oh my God, can you? I'm so
No,
impressed.
It was, yes, and I remember a lot of annoyance and a lot of desperation to get the hell out of that situation. Yeah, to not be my mother. That's what I wanted.
And then we all turn into her in the end, don't we?
Well, don't we always? As a matter of fact, just tonight when I was putting on my makeup, I thought, "Jeez, I look like my mother." You can't.
I find myself talking like my mother, which is really unnerving.
Alarming. It's alarming.
She
But
died at
anyway.
95, right?
Yeah,
I
dear.
can still
Well,
hear it.
somebody came through town who's offered to take off, says, "Oh, she's so very beautiful." And he says, "Oh, well, I'm a movie producer, and I would just be very happy to take you to Hollywood and put you in the movies. And not only that, but I think I love you and I want to marry you." And she goes, "Wow, let's go." And it doesn't work out like she thinks it's going
Yeah,
to.
but what's really a lot of fun for those of us living here in Arizona is that his path from Boynton, Oklahoma to California with the 15-year-old that he has seduced and is about to sell is through northern Arizona, or through Arizona. And coincidentally, there was another book, the name of which I cannot remember, which came out with a very similar kind of it goes in a completely different direction, but the same thing happens, that you have three people who decide to jump away from an abusive situation where they are basically being trafficked by some guy in, amazingly, northern Arizona. And they go to Hollywood, and I think part of it is because of the railroad. You could get
That's
from
where the
northern Arizona to
railroad
Hollywood.
ran. Yeah, that's exactly right. The railroad ran right across the top.
Flagstaff.
That's right, ran right across the top from LA to Chicago.
Right. Used to go through the Feather River Canyon and all that
That's
good
right.
stuff, which is now underwater. But,
That's right. But she manages to escape the guy.
so Blanche, right, we can't tell you too much about it.
No,
Ends
yeah.
in northern Arizona, and by another fortunate coincidence, runs into a Hollywood star. And
Which was also an interesting research because I discovered that in fact they made a lot of Western movies in Prescott.
let's talk to Betty here for a moment, because Betty wrote one of her great Lena Jones books about the filming, although a lot later, right, Betty?
Right, yeah,
Um,
it was in the 90s.
In the 90s. No, it was earlier than that, wasn't it?
It was later than that. It was later than that, yeah.
When did John Wayne die?
Oh, you're talking about the John Wayne movie.
I am.
Okay, yeah, that happened,
In the 50s.
I don't know when he died actually, but everybody in Snow Canyon, Utah, who had been filming the movie The Conqueror, Genghis Khan, 50% of that film set and the handlers died, and the stars died of various cancers. It was because
Of the atomic testing and the winds that went on in
and
northern.
that was probably in the 50s, I believe.
These are
Yeah.
60s, early 60s.
Susan Hayward and John Wayne were two of those who, both of them died, although John Wayne, he was a chain smoker, so he might have died anyhow. But so anyway, she too wrote a book about movies, but a lot later being filmed here on
Yeah, there was a whole
Desert Wind
Yeah,
is the
there's
name
a
of that
whole
book.
big the western a lot of odors out here. Tom Mix, who had a ranch outside of Prescott, and he's
And he has a monument to where he died on the
That's
road
right.
from Apache
Florence,
Junction
yeah.
down to Florence. There's an actual Tom Mix memorial, because he was killed and it was a car crash, wasn't it?
Yeah.
On the road there.
Yeah,
I
he was
mean,
my
at least we're talking to people who know Tom Mix who he was. Bruce, we're sort of a senior crowd here. I doubt if many millennials, if you said Tom Mix, would have. Do you know who Tom Mix is, Martin? You're not a millennial.
I know the
Do you
name.
know the name?
movie.
He was a
20s,
big
it
Western
was,
star.
Western star's my dad's favorite.
And he
Father
had,
loved
they all had a horse with a name. Remember?
Tony the Wonder Horse.
That was right, because I can still remember the early television, Hopalong Cassidy and the Lone Hi-O Silver, all that stuff. The horse was like Dr. Watson. It really was.
I remember how it was silver.
You do. I can still remember my little sister. They showed Hopalong Cassidy on Friday night. Probably NBC, but I can't really remember when, the early TV. And then they had a rerun on Saturday afternoon. And my little sister would hide on the stairs because she was so scared and during Friday night. But on Saturday, when she knew how it came out, she would come out and sit in front of the TV and she would go, Hoppy, Remember all that? It was so much fun. Why aren't there more Westerns on television anymore? Because remember, there was just
so many.
It was Bonanza and, who was, and Gunsmoke and even Route 66 and the Virginian and Rawhide and oh my God, yeah, right. Maybe you're going to single-handedly restore our interest.
Westerns, that's right.
It would really be fun.
But, she ends up, meeting movie stars and she ends up, I don't know how much I can say.
Well, she ends up in Hollywood, but coincidentally, there is a young private investigator working in Hollywood who is present when bones are found buried on the beach in Santa Monica, is it? Santa Monica. So that's all we really need to say. You could probably work out who the bones belong to, and and who is then the suspect, right? In all of that. But what's really fun is that Donis presents this kind of like a silent movie. So when you read it now, there are mixed reactions. Some people think that the silent movie. Remember the black screen that you would get in a silent movie when the dialogue would come out? Right. So they're in the. I think they're in the finished book, aren't they?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, we have title cards.
I think the title cards are really fun. Some people are irritated by them, but I think that they really. I
use them basically instead of chapter headings. Basically.
But what's on the title cards is relevant to the story.
Yeah.
So read them in that spirit that you're watching a silent movie.
I actually thought I would make the book rather like a silent movie. Yeah, so it does have a little overblown quality to it.
That's part of the fun.
Yeah, that's
doesn't
what I
actually
thought.
read like Donis. That's the interesting part.
It is different, so that's it is somewhat different. Yeah, well, it's quite a bit different than the others. The language and everything has a lot of 1920s slang instead of Oklahoma slang. So
I was enchanted. I really, really love it. So I hope that you all will enjoy it too. And I do recommend, since it's a clear bargain price, that if you haven't read The Wrong Hill to Die On, you buy it and read that one first and then read this one, because it's like a two-part story for Blanche, who has a sequel coming, which might be called The Murder of Valentino.
We'll see. Yeah, it has to do with Valentino. So
Rudolph.
Who in fact makes an appearance in this book. He's a friend of hers when she becomes famous. So.
And who did die, somewhat surprisingly.
At the age of 31.
Like Houdini. I mean, there's some really, it's amazing how many Hollywood or entertainment figures have not necessarily suspicious this, but unexpected this. Which is great material, right? If you're a crime writer, you can go back and go, Right. So Martin, talk to us a little bit about the British Library Crime Classics, because there's a new one out called Christmas Card Crimes,
Yes.
which is totally seasonal. And this is one of your anthologies
Yes.
as opposed to a whole novel. How do you go about constructing the anthologies?
Well, I've put together a lot of anthologies over the years. The British Library books have been incredibly successful in sales terms, because you're always told as a writer that anthologies don't sell, but the British Library ones have really done remarkably well. And the idea is to produce a book that's in the same vein as the crime classics, but really is a collection of short stories over the kind of period that the crime classics period spans. So turn of the century, start of the 20th century, up to the 50s, and maybe into the 60s. And each anthology is built around a particular theme. So there's been a Locked Room Mystery collection called Miraculous Murders. There's been a country house themed book, Murder at the Manor. Resorting to Murder, which is about holiday murders. Foreign Bodies, which is crime in translation. Classic stories.
Blood on the Tracks.
Blood on the Tracks, which is railway. It's not Bob Dylan's story. It's railway stories, and so on. So there've been a number of Christmas collections. Silent Nights was the first one. Then Crimson Snow was the second, and now
Santa Claus Murders was another.
Well, that was a novel.
Is that a whole novel?
That's a novel by Mavis Storial Hay, yes. So that was the first of the Christmas books. And that was the very first, I think, of the Golden Age crime classics.
Was it? Number one?
Yes, it was. Because what happened was that about 8 years ago, British Library discovered that they had one or two very rare and significant Victorian novels. There's one called The Notting Hill Mystery, which is arguably the first detective novel. An interesting book as well. And what happened was that the library published as original paperback reprints 3 of these historically significant Victorian crime stories. There was The Notting Hill Mystery, there was Revelations of a Lady Detective, and another one called The Female Detective. And these were significant books, but they didn't sell particularly well for whatever reason. And so they decided to move forward in time terms to the 1930s. They discovered that an incredibly obscure female writer who only wrote 3 books called Mavis Storial Hay. And the first of these books was called The Santa Claus Murder. So they published that, and it didn't sell very well. And so they got a fresh idea. They decided that they would publish the books in future in this series, if it continued after Mavis, with new covers, new jacket artwork, and they would use these old vintage railway posters as background, British Railway vintage posters. And so the next 2 books by Mavis came out with those covers. It was about this time that I had a chance meeting with the guy who was running this little series. He just arrived at the British Library. I had a cup of coffee with him. He said, we're going to publish a couple more by a guy called John Bude. One was called Cornish Coast Murders, and one was called The Lake District Murder. And he said, would you like to write a couple of introductions? So I agreed. And the books came out, and a few weeks later he got on the phone and said, these books are selling incredibly well. We're very surprised. The others didn't do anything. So, of course, I would like to think it's the witty, erudite introductions, but I think those covers have a lot to do with it. And so I was originally asked to do 2 introductions, and now there have been 70 odd. There's been 1 book a month for 6 years or so, with a programme going on into next year. And as part of that, as Barbara says, there have been these anthologies, and the Christmas Card Crime is a seasonal anthology to coming up at this time of year.
So, since you're the editor of the anthologies, do you select the stories?
Yes,
You
yes,
do,
I come up with the story ideas. I suggest to the library a certain number of stories, and then they, thankfully, are the people who have to seek the copyright permissions if the stories are in copyright. And so I tend to suggest more than we might need, just in case there are one or two problems. For instance, if you can't find who owns the rights to the story, these problems do crop up from time to time. Trying to find the heirs to fairly obscure writers can be quite difficult, and sometimes they employ genealogists to check into wills of the writers to find out who inherited the loot.
Oh, Lord, Martin, there's bound to be a book in
Yeah.
that.
Well, I'm the one who's going to write it. Trust
You
me.
will.
Yeah. So there is some detective work.
Of course there is. So Martin has won an Edgar and other awards for The Golden Age of Murder, which is a book that kind of grew out of this. I've known Martin forever. He's a solicitor in Liverpool. We've known each other for like 30 years or something,
like
right?
that.
And it's been interesting to see him come along as he's moving away, maybe now fully retired. Not quite. From his law practice, he's taken on much more of editing work and so forth. I do think that that the covers have had a really significant role.
Yes.
And there's a new project that you may or may not have heard of, which is the Library of Congress. Our library has decided to do Library of Congress crime classics, also being published by Poison Pen Press. And it's first books will come out, 6 of them. Is it 6, Diane, next year? Or is it just 3? Well, anyway, one of them is Sue Grafton's father's book, The Rat Began to Gnaw the Rope, which was kind of a legacy that Sue left to me. And I was really happy that the library, because they actually get to decide which stories, will be the stories, agreed to do that. Because I think it had a lot to do with shaping Sue as a writer. So if you're a Sue Grafton fan, you should want to read it just to see what influence that had. But it's not as clear about the covers from the Library of Congress as it is the old railway posters, and so I'm not entirely clear that that will be such a group brand, so to speak, because I do think the railroad posters actually have established the brand for the British Library.
Yes, and it's made those books very collectible. And I meet a lot of people in Britain who are collecting the whole series, and that's something that doesn't happen a great deal, really, in Britain. Sometimes people collect the old green penguins.
Right.
But these British Library books are very collectible, and there are lots of people determined to have every single one, which is great.
I will say, a little commercial here, that the Christmas theme ones are wonderful. And if you're looking for stocking stuffers and so forth, you can hardly go wrong. I really like this new Christmas card, Christmas Crimes. Is that what's it actually called?
It's the Christmas Card Crime.
Thank you. The Christmas card crime is, bright, lots of snow, all that other stuff. Now, I did ask Martin as we were drinking our Sancerre. They had a half price over at the Valley Ho online, luckily. Whether he thought they were going to run out of quality Golden Age books, because there's always a lot published that is not quality in any era, and so I'm hoping that you will continue with the A and B list and not drop down into the C or D list.
Yeah, I'm very confident about that, and looking to next year. And I know that the programme in the States sometimes runs a few months behind Britain, but in the first 6 months in Britain next year, to be published, there will be a book that won a Gold Dagger, The Spoiled Kill by Mary Kelly, which is a brilliant book. It's the kind of book that is a kind of bridge between the Golden Age and Ruth Rendell, if you like. Mary Kelly was a top writer, but
So that's in the very late, the upper age limit of your.
Yes, it's 1961.
Ooh, 1961! My God, you spilled over 1960, Martin. Awesome.
That's right. And there is another book from about 1953, which is a very entertaining locked room mystery called The Woman in the Wardrobe, by Peter Shaffer, the playwright better known for Equus and Amadeus, Royal Hunt of the Sun. But he wrote detective novels when he was a young man. And The Woman in the Wardrobe is a very enjoyable book. It's been out of print and very hard to find and very expensive if you do find it. So that's another one that's coming out. There's going to be one by Carol Carnac, another alias of E.C.R. Lorak, called Crossed Skis, which is a very enjoyable mystery. I really like that one. There's going to be another anthology, Sporting Mysteries, Settling Scores. So there's a good mix of books coming out, and I'm very confident there will be more to come.
And Martin is working on another Lake District mystery, and I told him that HarperCollins is just diving into its vaults, thanks to the British Library, I think, is an inspiration, is now republishing Reg Hill, who's one of my favorite authors, and whose books have been out of print now for some time. So Martin's Lake District mysteries are very much in the vein of Peter Robinson and Reg Hill, and he's working on another one. So all very exciting. Right.
I was going to ask now. You are. She said you're semi-retired now, but I saw that you were a solicitor.
I am. Yes.
Yeah, and I was thinking, how in God's name can you do all of this? You're working as full-time solicitor, but you must be partially retired, because finding all of these works and republishing them, and like you said, doing all of the research on them and everything like that would be a full-time job. Besides the books, this book, by the way, was fantastic, I thought, and talk about interesting twists. It's really got some
I
interesting
really like
twists.
what it says
Yeah.
on the back here,
Yeah.
sooty, sulphurous, and malign.
Yes, it is.
Isn't that
It
great?
is malign, all right.
The
But,
air
uh,
quality
it's
in
got
London
some
was
nice
truly
twists,
awful.
But I really liked Rachel. I like Rachel, and I like Jacob too, and I like how someone who's, again, well, that's like I did, someone who's rather naive to start out with. He's not so much when the book ends up. So I thought that was very, very interesting. But how did you find writing a woman? I assume you've done this before.
Yeah, well, my first series had a male protagonist, a lawyer. Write what you know. So I was a full-time lawyer in those days. And then I started with the Lake District series, which had two protagonists with a developing relationship. One a woman, a cold case cop, Hannah, and one a male historian. So he's delving into the past in a different way, and he's Daniel. And so the concept of that series is that they move very, very slowly towards each other during the course of the series. So I'd had the experience of writing the Hannah scene, and so writing Rachel, I suppose, was a kind of natural progression. I felt, I'm sure you must find this, that the more you write, the more you publish, you get more confident. So you try to do things that you might not have ventured to begin with, and you try to stretch yourself.
Sometimes it works.
Yeah, sometimes it doesn't. And in fact, what I did with Rachel, when I had the idea of the character, I write a lot of short stories. And I wrote a short story about the character, which I've never tried to publish. But it was just an idea of writing it as an exercise to see whether I liked writing about the character. And I did. So that encouraged me to get on with the book. And so that was, I suppose, an unusual thing to do, but it was a good way of getting myself into the mindset of the character.
Well, one thing that I really liked about her, I like angry women.
It's dangerous to know.
I have tried. Donis in person is not Donis on the page. It's really fascinating to me. Nor actually is Martin, now that I think about it. So maybe all those years of solicitor, you actually thought about killing clients, but never came away.
No, I like my clients. It's my partners I wanted to kill. But of course, to go back to your point, I was a full-time partner in a law firm for many years, but since I became part-time, I've had more time to devote to what I always wanted to do, which was to be a crime writer. So what could be nicer?
Martin's a really interesting story, and over 30 years he's suddenly become an overnight success. And
That's
really,
encouraging.
no, I mean, it really has been a very long career arc for you, hasn't it? 'Cause I remember, we've known each other back when, yeah. So, it's always, I always say to people, Rex Stout wrote 49 books before he wrote the first Neuro Wolf. 49 books before he wrote the very first Neuro Wolf. So, yeah. So I mean, I think it's important to recognize that, that authors, sometimes careers are a very long time in the making. And sometimes the idea that really catches hold is not the first idea most of the time. In fact, it's not the first idea.
That's absolutely right, and if you're able to keep at it, then your confidence does grow. And of course, the one advantage I've had from being a solicitor is not legal knowledge, which doesn't really help in my books, but it was having an income stream. So I was able to write the books always that I wanted to write, not the books that particular publishers wanted me to write. And in fact, I've moved around in Britain from one publisher to another, trying to find one that, now 2 or 3, that really got what I was trying to do. But that's a luxury in a way, and it does help to have another career, even if it does mean a bit of time management, because it is important to write what you really care about, and hope that the wheel of fashion will eventually turn in your direction. The early books, the books about the lawyer, Harry Devlin, set in Liverpool, these were books where my concept from day one was to have a combination of a gritty modern setting in Liverpool with golden age plots. And that those books did pretty well in their day, but not one critic ever talked about the golden age plot. By book 6, I was so desperate. Not only did I name check Agatha Christie, I actually used the plot of Agatha Christie's and turned it round. And I mentioned the book in question, and still nobody mentioned it. And that was because in the 1990s, in general, although Christie's a phenomenon, golden age detective fiction was not in fashion, and I didn't feel I was in fashion at all at that time either. And it's taken a long time. I'm quite sure the crime classics wouldn't have done well in the 90s, but the wheel has turned. Whether it's because of the world we're living in, who knows? But of course, it does help if you can hang on and wait all those decades until things finally start to move.
Well, my luck was finding Barbara, because the series that I wrote, nobody else would have. But that's what that series spoke to me, and I felt that it needed to be done. And I mean, I loved it, and I loved the characters and everything like that. And I don't know that anybody else would have taken a chance on it or anything. She stuck with me all the way through those 10 books. I don't know if anybody else would have.
I was seduced by the titles. Who could possibly resist the old buzzard had it coming? But even better, one of my father's very favorite words was the title of Donis' second book, Hornswoggled. He was a child of Nebraska in the first part of the 20th century, and Hornswoggled was a great word, So it was. I think it was partly my dad speaking to me, when you publish those. I've liked all your titles, which I think are amazing and totally non-commercial.
That's the deal. They're just not that commercial, but they're. I think that they're also something that speaks to people who, with their, I think that's a kind of a background that a lot of people have, and it's a type of person that I think doesn't get the respect that she ought to, and I don't know that anybody else would have seen that. Really, I know they wouldn't have. I just got very lucky that way.
Well, we both did. It was wonderful. And Donis has a past career as a librarian, as many of you may know. So she too had an income stream.
At one time, well, yeah, and actually, yeah, I had had a husband who allowed me to quit working and write, actually, so that made a huge difference too. Though I always wrote, but
You did. I sent Donis's first book to Tony Hillerman because they said that Alifair Tucker, he had written a wonderful biography called, oh Lord, what is the name of it? Sorry, I'm having a blank on that. Anyway, a major part of his autobiography is his mother, a woman in Oklahoma. And Alifair Tucker pretty much personifies Tony Hillerman's mother. So I sent him a copy of The Old Buzzard Had It Coming and said, Tony, it's your mom. And he wrote Donis a wonderful quote, and he said, you're absolutely right. You know, this really is my mom, you know, who, I mean, he's from Oklahoma. He's not a New Mexican by birth. He was brought up in Oklahoma. And I think he recognized, you know, those same qualities.
talking about I like angry women, and I think that I kind of grew up a little bit angry for being a woman, and also for being from Oklahoma. Because once you leave Oklahoma, people have an opinion of you immediately. Yes.
He's like Nebraska. I can't ask my dad, unfortunately, because he's been gone a while. But that's an interesting question. Does that come up with Liverpool? Of course, you've got the Beatles, so you've got this huge advantage.
Well, Liverpool is. I wasn't born in Liverpool. I've worked in Liverpool. I've never actually lived in the city, but I've worked there for over 30 years. And it's a fascinating place. But it's a place that's had a lot of problems, and it's Liverpudlians are very funny, witty people, but very, very protective of the city. So they can criticise it, but nobody else can criticise it. So when people do, including the current Prime Minister, who's persona non grata in Liverpool, because he once published an article that was critical. Yeah, it's a strange city, but a very intoxicating one. And
It was a major port. If you sail up the river now, there are windmills in it, so they're doing a huge amount with wind. The Tate Modern from London has a branch in the old Liverpool docks. And you have to love a city where the people are called Liverpudlians. Isn't that great? It sounds like Gulliver. It really does.
That's right, and they are naturally witty. I'm still doing a bit of law, and I went into the office a few weeks ago, and I was talking to my secretary, and she was discussing the latest of many changes in the office. And she says, I won't trouble you with the Liverpool accent, but she says, if you sit down long enough, you'll be archived. And that's a classic bit of Liverpool humour.
Well, I think we should take questions from the audience. And if you'd like to ask either author a question. Yes, ma'am.
Donis, you started out writing stories that you had heard from your family, through working them into Alifair and her family. Are there still family stories that you're working through this book, or are you through with
For
this
this particular book, let me think. No, I don't think so. In this particular book, oh yes, in fact, this matter of fact, the bad guy is in fact based on the man who married my great aunt. Yes, as a matter of fact, his name is the absolute reverse of this particular man. Yeah. So yes, I don't know that anything that ever happens to you doesn't end up in the book in one fashion or another. Is that true?
Well, as a lawyer, I have lengthy disclaimers at the end of all my books. I'll leave you to draw your own conclusion.
It'd be kind of hard if you have a really remarkable case not to let some echo of it sneak in. Yes, ma'am.
Do you see this as a series, like of 10 or 5?
Yes, I intended this as kind of an origin story, and then if it works out, I hope to have her and the detective, because she has an end to a society that he doesn't have, and then he has skills that she doesn't have. So it's fun to use a lot of these old movie stars. In the second book I'm working on, it's just full of old movie stars, and Barbara's going to have to tell me if I'm name dropping too much in this particular book.
The lucky thing is that there are so many scandals and terrible stories.
I
now
know,
and so forth.
absolutely.
You hardly even have to think up a plot to write about Hollywood
Exactly
in the
right.
1920s. You know, I mean, seriously, it's amazing. And do any of you remember reading like Photoplay, or you remember all those Hollywood scandal magazines? I used to, you know, take my $1 allowance as a kid, ride my bicycle up, you know, to downtown Winnetka, and you could buy, you know, like Screenplay, or remember Hedda Hopper, and who was her big rival?
Willa Parsons.
Thank you. Luella, I mean, they were the gossip mongers. They were the poison pen letters of their day. And amazingly, Rock Hudson was my grandmother's mailman. His name is Roy Fitzgerald. I also went to high school with Aunt Margaret, who used to wear my clothes because her mother was too poor to afford to buy her anything. So we sang together, and I got into all kinds of trouble with my parents because I would smuggle out some of my formal dresses so Annie could wear them for concerts because she didn't have any money or any way to do it. But anyway, Roy Fitzgerald turned into Rock Hudson, and of course he was gay. But nobody wanted, you know, to acknowledge that, and so they had these like faux romances. Remember with Doris Day,
that was one
and
thing I
all the
remember
rest
about
of it.
it, yeah.
He eventually died of AIDS, so they couldn't quite, you know, overcome that. But you know, that was all part of that, you know, Hollywood secrecy. You know,
That was in this book too. They had sort of made up the studios sort of made up a background for her.
Exactly.
Yeah. They created, and they,
So Blanche is part of that whole spin, right?
That's right. Yeah, they had made up a whole background for her and a new name and all this.
Bianca,
Dasher.
Liz.
And yours is the morality clauses, right?
Well, later they
No,
did.
not them.
Not in the
No,
Maybe
no.
the morality clause.
It was when the censors came in. I think it might have been.
Very late 20s, early 30s.
I think it was in the 30s, yeah.
Yeah.
And there were, you know, they were like awash in drugs and so forth. I mean, you think cocaine's a new problem. Guess again, you could actually drink it in Coca-Cola, you know, which everybody, there's a reason it's called Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
Because they actually had cocaine in it.
They actually had, sometimes would arrange marriages between gay actors
Right.
and lesbians so that they would be, you know.
Randolph Scott was another. I'm trying to remember. There's a whole bunch of them that you can sort of find out now. And then there were, you know, there were a certain amount of bisexual people, and then they all slept around like crazy, you know, as they tried to, and then they would manufacture respectable dates, which, you know, for people who hardly even knew each other. But you know what? The English are really good at this too, Martin.
I thought you were talking about living a legal profession.
I'm thinking way back to Edward VII and his mistresses, and you know, it was the whole thing.
Yeah, and Victorian era as well.
Right, as arranged marriages were not romantic as a general rule. So, what was the deal? You had an heir and a spare, and then you could then, you know, but you had to be discreet and, you know, maintain a facade.
Yeah,
Right. So there's lots of fun stuff you can
absolutely.
write about. In the golden age, this was still true, right?
Well, Dorothy L. Sayers had an illegitimate child. She was devoutly religious. It was, and nobody knew until she died in the late 50s, and nobody knew. But this child was brought up by a cousin, and it was a great sadness to her because he actually went to the same Oxford College that Lord Peter Wimsey went to, and got a first like Lord Peter, but she couldn't share that parental joy because it was a terrible secret. It's a very sad story.
That's like, was it Loretta Young who had a child? She ended up adopting her own child.
The point is that they had to maintain a facade, whether you were British or in Hollywood or whatever, as long as you had this facade maintained, what went on behind it. I'm addicted to Regency story. I absolutely loved that period. And Lord, they were just, you know, they were like rabbits. But as long as they, you know, kept up the facade, you know, you were You were in great shape. Were the Golden Age mysteries more moral in that sense? Was that, you know, I'm not sure I remember all that bedroom hopping and stuff in them.
Well, the moral climate of the time didn't allow for any explicit sex.
So there was kind of a code like
But,
the Hollywood code.
It was the morals of the age, really. But the other thing about the Golden Age, everybody talks about it as being very cosy and conventional period, bloodless, you know, compared to the, you know, gory graphic novels of today. But you have to remember that these were writers who had lived through the First World War. The men had fought in the trenches, people like Henry Wade, severely wounded in the trenches. Anthony Barker was gassed. Agatha Christie's brother was severely affected. Various other female writers had lovers who were killed. So they lived through the slaughter, and they didn't need to put it in the books. They wanted to escape from it. So it wasn't squeamishness. It wasn't excessive delicacy. It was just they'd had a belly full of it, and they wanted to have fun, and they wanted to play. And the idea of the game between the reader and the writer, can you figure out the mystery before the great detective? That was the big driver, particularly in the 1920s.
So that may be part of the appeal at the moment as the world seems to be careening off into hell. Is that escapism is, I mean, you know, it's really nice to read about a period where you know how it all came out. And, you know, it's comforting to see that we all did that and survived. Does anyone? Well, Downton, yeah, which is having another moment thanks to the movie. Right. I think the Franny Fisher books, the Miss Fisher, which we also publish, I think have a lot to do with, you know, that kind of escape. And there's a wonderful series a week from tomorrow. We have an international night. It's really interesting. We have two authors from South Africa who write together as Michael Stanley, and they write the Detective Kubu books, which are set in Botswana, and they have a new book about, it's set in South Africa with poaching. And then we have 4 Australians who got a grant from the Australian government, and they are here, they have different publishers. It's a really interesting and remarkable concept, and they all write different things, but Sulari Gentle, who is another author that I edit, is writing about Australia in the 1930s. And I think her books are absolutely amazing because we all know about Europe in the 1930s, right? And we know about America. Which one of you knows that Australia was an absolute hotbed of fascism and communism and anti-immigration and, I mean, you know, but the protagonist is basically Lord Peter Wimsey, Roland Sinclair. He's Lord Peter. In a slightly more bohemian way, but very similar. And I think her books are fabulous. So they will all be here next Tuesday night, which I recommend. And tomorrow night, Martin is going to be talking to Nicholas Meyer, who is the Sherlockian that wrote the 7% Solution and has a new Sherlock Holmes book. But here's what's interesting about the new Sherlock Holmes book. It's set in the Ukraine. Oh my God! It is unbelievably topical. It's anti-Semitic, and I mean the protocols involved in it are anti-Semitic, and the whole thing takes place on the Orient Express going to Istanbul, and then they travel on into the Ukraine, where guess what? The same stuff that we're currently reading about is going on. I mean, he couldn't have timed that book. It was like genius. So anyway, Martin and Nicholas Meyer will be here tomorrow night, and Nicholas's editor, who is one of my very favorite people, Keith Kayla, whom many of you may have met at crime conferences, is also coming. So I think Martin and Keith and Nicholas will all talk about the whole Sherlockian universe and this particular. It's really going to be fun, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, very excited. So, Patrick, let me see, you're standing there. Let me wave goodbye to our video audience so that you can